welcome to my podcast. I'm Jkaplan, and I'm going to be discussing the following 3 decades: the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. I chose these decades because I'm fascinated by the social and technological changes that accompanied the transition to the third wave, the information age. The key technological advances I will discuss are the invention of the personal computer and its continued development, the World Wide Web, the interactive whiteboards and smartboards, and the smartphone phenomenon. The 1980s saw tremendous technological improvements in the area of personal computing. While the first personal computers were invented back in the 1970s, the 1980s saw a proliferation of devices, some successful, some less so, that could be used to bring computer technology into homes, businesses, and schools. In 1981, IBM introduced a personal computer that would become very popular and would help the company corner the market for years to come. In 1984, the Apple Macintosh was introduced. At first, Apple computers captured only a tiny fraction of the market, but the company's vision and devotion to innovation influenced the development of technology in later decades. In other communications technology news, mobile phones were beginning to be developed, but through most of the decade they were scarce since they were unaffordable for most people. In the 1980s, schools used their new computers, when they were available at all, as more expensive typewriters. Since teachers and administrators were mostly unfamiliar with the new technology, it wasn't effectively adapted for classroom use. Many schools did no more with them than teach students typing skills. The progressive trend in education from the 1970s was condemned by a report commissioned by President Reagan, which declared a rising tide of mediocrity in education. Though the Soviet Union eventually fell apart during this decade, in the early years it was still seen as a major competitor on the world stage, a threat we would need to combat in part through better science, technology, math, and engineering education. Other developments in the field of education included new ways of understanding learning differences, such as Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, and new developments in understanding attention deficit disorder. The theory of multiple intelligences holds that there are many ways of learning, and someone who struggles with one way might excel in another. Attention deficit disorder, once seen as a sign of brain damage or incompetent parenting, became an accepted diagnosis with various types of treatment available. The major change on the world stage was the collapse of the Soviet Union and decreased influence of communism on other countries like China, aided in part by the images broadcast on the news of protesters in many countries. The video of a lone protester standing before the tanks in Tiananmen Square inspired those who fought for democracy, while the images of the Berlin Wall being torn down drove home the news that the Soviet Union had lost its ability to control its satellite nations. The 1990s were largely defined by the explosion of new technologies, refinements of old technologies, and tech-related businesses. Computers increased in ability and decreased in price, making them affordable to many more American families. Before, computers were more useful to programmers and tech-savvy individuals, but now ordinary consumers were finding ways that computers could help them in their everyday lives. The invention of the World Wide Web made home computing more compelling, even for people who were less technologically inclined. AOL, America Online, brought many new users to the internet, introducing them to new ways of gathering information and communicating with both friends and strangers. New developments were being made in aiding children with autism and ADD. Adderall was approved by the FDA, and floor time was thought by many to be an effective way to engage autistic children and build their social abilities. The use of the World Wide Web enabled parents and educators to learn more about these new ways to help children, as well as share their own experiences and thoughts. In schools, it became clear that standards for achievement needed to be raised, since in a technology-filled world, students would need to be more competitive in math, science, and related fields. In fact, many people felt that education needed to really start even before a child formally enters the school system, since early interventions for minority or special needs children can help erase the achievement gap. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized, ensuring assistance and fair treatment to families with children who had special needs, both in the early childhood years and at school age. In 1997, Jeffrey Canada opened the Harlem Children's Zone, a strong attempt to aid minority children in a small inner-city area by providing help to parents and early childhood education to kids with an eye towards increasing scholastic achievement. It was thought by his supporters that a child's best chance to succeed came from being surrounded by a supportive, engaged community. The Family Leave and Medical Act of the early 90s also aided parents who wished to be present through their child's early years by giving them guaranteed time off from work without fear of losing their jobs. In the working world, technology companies expanded and multiplied at an astounding and ultimately unsustainable rate. For a while, tech companies seemed like a surefire way to make money, leading many schools to encourage students to study programming and other related fields. However, the business models of many of these new companies were not well planned and could not sustain a functioning business. Many people lost a great deal of money when the so-called dot-com bubble burst. However, some companies did survive and thrive, like Amazon.com, and these companies helped to redefine commerce as the next decade dawned. The 2000s began with a turn towards conservative politics in America that swiftly became a charge towards the neoconservative. The dot-com bubble burst, leading investors to lose a great deal of money, but not necessarily their willingness to overlook shoddy business models in favor of quick cash. Later in the decade, the collapse of the housing bubble, combined with the outcomes of predatory lending by banks, would lead to a dramatic economic crisis from which we have not yet emerged. Unemployment numbers were high as the decade ended. Some astoundingly successful online ventures appeared in this decade, like Facebook and Twitter. These social media tools grew more and more popular as they brought together people from all over the country and all over the world. Important inventions of this decade included smartphones, which helped people stay in constant contact with friends, family, coworkers, and clients. Smartphones made applications like Facebook and Twitter even more relevant, since they could be updated all the time from any location. Information retrieval and communication became much more portable and instantaneous. In schools, technology continued to grow in importance, and many schools began to bring in new tools such as smartboards or interactive whiteboards to engage students' interest and allow them to manipulate information in new ways. However, this kind of technology requires a lot of teacher training to make it effective, and this training does not always occur. There is also a tension between the high standards and penalties raised by 2001's No Child Left Behind Act and the use of technology in creative ways which might not always lead specifically to higher test scores. 2009's Race to the Top continued to raise standards, but again offers more incentive for test practice than creative uses of technology. As access to information increases, so does awareness of health and medical issues. 2003 saw a smoking ban put into effect in New York City to protect workers at bars and restaurants, and the birth control patch was invented, giving women more freedom over their reproductive choices. The last 3 decades have seen some stunning social and technological changes. Technology has brought people closer together and allowed the sharing of vast amounts of information globally, but the abundance of information has also led, in some part, to the fracturing of society and an increase in divisiveness. Most people are interested in acquiring only the information that supports their previously held beliefs. Still, technology has allowed people to reach out and create a global society, while the human need for connection has driven the development of new technologies in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s.